Hello, welcome back. Our previous video was about the philosophical dimensions of doing research. We explained the concepts of paradigms, the concepts of methodologies, techniques, and how do we all these fit together into our research project. This video is about how we applied all these concepts in our own projects. This will be done with the aid of a modeling technique that will be able to have a graphical representation of your project or your method or methodology you choose to do so. This video is divided into two different versions. We have two different versions of this video. One directed to undergrad and master's students, and the other one directed to PhD students. And the reasons we have this division is because the depth of research we can do in either of these two domains is different. For example, a PhD project is minimum of 3 years, whereas a master's dissertation is around 4 months. So we need to tackle it in different ways. Okay, so be sure that you are in the right version. Let's start with it. So which are the possible research methods or methodologies we have for undergrad and master dissertation projects? Okay, the first one we have is a survey. Surveys are not only the process of creating a questionnaire and delivering it. The survey has to start with a proper structured way of doing it. So you have to design your questionnaire, then you have to apply it to the sample that you want to use, and then you have to analyze the data. What is very important for you to notice in surveys is surveys are done for collecting information, large number of information. For example, if you do a survey of 30 people, it's not a good survey. If you want to do a statistical analysis with 30 samples, only 30 people is not enough, because statistics cannot render valuable information in this case. So surveys have to consider large numbers of people, okay? And as I said before, you need to have, you need to design your questionnaire properly. So I would suggest you to go with your supervisor about which questions are you gonna ask. You have to think about what information you wanna get from your audience, and therefore design your survey in that way, your questionnaire. Then you have to think about how you're gonna apply it. You're gonna do it online, you're gonna do it on the streets, and so on and so forth. And then you have to have time to analyze information in the way you want it to do. It sounds simple, but it's not that simple. So you need to do more research about how surveys can be done and what is a proper way of doing surveys. The second method we have is something we call case study, which are quite special in the sense that they are not method itself. If you remember, a methodology or a method is a sequence of steps that you have to follow to achieve something. So when you look into case studies, you don't find that sequence of steps. It's not there in the literature. So what it really means is a case study is that you have an object which you want to study in more detail to try to test your theories or to come out with theories from your study. So for example, you can have organizations, you can have any company that I can go through it, and then I have a theory I want to test, and then therefore I go there and I try to get the data to see whether my theory is right or not. So there are many ways of doing case study. You can do it one in depth, which you take one organization and you take it a long study, or you can use also more case studies. For example, I want to analyze how SMEs behave, so I go to 3 organizations instead of going only to one, and I study a bit less in those 3, but I have more samples of them. So there are advantages and disadvantages of using a case study, but you can take a look at that in the literature, what tells you more about these kind of things. The last option you have is that you can use also more complex methods like action research and design research. If you are lucky enough to have an organization in which you are working or they give you access to. But if you want to use more complex methods, that they are a bit more for longer and more complicated projects, then take a look at the information we have in the PhD version, which we explain more about these issues. Surveys and case studies, however, need to be structured following a methodology. For example, normally when I have large projects, if I use action research, I can use action research as my sequence of steps I'm going to be doing, but I can apply action research in a case study, for example, in an organization. So in this case, I'm using case study as my method or object of study, but I'm using the methodology behind it is the action research. So as you can see, we need to have an umbrella methodology that guides us the whole process, which saying that we use case studies is not enough. So what do we do about this? If we are not going to be using complex methods like the one we have in the literature, like action research, design research, and all the ones we have there, if we are not going to be using those ones, what an undergrad and MS student can do? And the answer is in the next slide. Well, the answer depends pretty much on the type of project you're going to be working. For example, one type of projects we have in the information system domain is about developing or design some software. If you are doing development or design of software, the answer is very simple. You just have to look at the software development methodologies we have available, like the SDLC or Software Development Lifecycle. We also call it the waterfall model, or many other methodologies to design information systems. So you can use either of those ones and then follow the steps in that one. So that will be the methodology that it will be guiding you in your project. And the reason this is happening is because you are not doing actual research there, but you are developing a product. So then, therefore, to develop a product, which is a software, you use the methodology that they tell you there, which is the sequence of steps. So that will be basically your research methodology. If your project involves an organization, or as we call it, a case study, or you are going to develop any kind of survey, we still have to have a structured way of doing that. So in order for providing you with this and for you not to go with complex methodologies, I will suggest you to use the following template that I have for you, which I call the undergrad, postgrad research methodology for case studies. This methodology, and it's a methodology because I have a series of steps that if I follow will render probably the same result. So this methodology has 4 steps, 4 basic phases, as I call them, which is the first one we call the exploratory or the pilot phase, in which we use that one to understand the context of the problem and to come out with possible solutions with that. So normally when we have a project, we already have an aim and objectives defined before we start with the project. So we have an idea what we want to do. So this phase will help us to understand better that idea, to go to the organization, understand how it works if you're working in an organization, or if you're thinking to do a survey, to think a bit more carefully about how you're going to design that software or what is that software about. Then the next phase will be the diagnosis phase. That in that one, once you have a bit more of information, you can have a better diagnosis of what is the problem that you have. You are more informed about your problem, and then you can select a defined solution. Maybe in the exploratory phase you have some options about you don't know what you want to do, and in the diagnostic phase you can have a bit more of that definition. Then the next step would be the testing of implementation. So then you either test your theories you want to do in your case study, whatever kind of techniques you want to use, or you just implement what you want to implement during the case study. For example, would be the implementation of the survey, if you want to put a survey. Okay, so it can be in that case. So finally, you have the phase of the evaluation, in which you evaluate what you have done so far. Okay. If you have time to have iterations, you can have iterations. For example, between phase 1 and 2, you can have a couple of iterations there. So then you do an exploratory, then you do a diagnosis. Maybe you want to do a second phase on the exploratory, so you can have an iteration in that one. Same thing in the diagnosis, testing, implementation. So as I said before, methodologies are not necessarily linear and can be iterative. So then you can use this one as such. Well, the method that I just showed you is a method that I have come up with. So that doesn't mean that cannot be applied. I mean, I think that you need to talk to your supervisors and discuss the situation. The idea of having a method is to have a structured way of doing your project, and all methods are for doing that. So the fact that we come up with this one and it doesn't have reference, it doesn't mean that might not be valid. But you need to discuss that with your supervisor, and maybe they suggest you to use other kind of methods that are more aligned to what they want. But I don't see why this couldn't be useful. Another thing that you need to see as well is that having the method is just not enough for having your research project. The method is the structure, the phases that we're going to follow, but we also have to see that other methods and techniques work in combination to create your project. So how can we combine all this? How is this combined in a project? And this is why precisely I want to present you with the modeling technique that I will show you soon. So how you do model this process of your project, this method, how do you model it, and how can you include other things, combinations of methods, techniques, and tools that work together towards your research project. Okay, so let's see the next slide. Well, unfortunately, we're not going to see this type of models, or these ones, but these ones. To tell you how this works, let me use an example. The first thing that you need to have to develop this, to have a project, you have to have very well defined which are your aim and objectives. So we have another video that will tell you how to get to this point, but many of you can get to this point on your own, and you have done this by discussing with supervisor. So the example that we have here is an example of an undergrad or an MSc project. The aim of the study, the aim of this project, is to rank the critical success factors when developing an information system in small and medium enterprises. As you can see, what is very important from this aim is that it has to be defined in the way that you have an output of this. What will be the output of this research? The output of this research would be the rank of the critical success factors. That's the final product, what I call a final product, or in my modeling technique I will call that artifacts. I will tell you that later on. Okay, so the objectives to do that, so that we divide our aim into different objectives. In this case we have 4 objectives. I recommend you not to have more than 7 and less than 3. So, and in this case we have 4. So the objective is to identify from the literature a list of critical success factors for developing information systems in general and in particular for SMEs. So this means that you have to do literature review. So I'm going to be doing literature review to identify the critical success factors in general and to see whether there is some information in the literature that is directed to SMEs. Then my second objective is to gather data from the small and medium enterprises that have gone through the process of implementing information systems. So this data can be gathered in many different ways. So by saying this only, we don't know yet if we're going to use qualitative data or quantitative data. I will explain that to you later on. Then to analyze the data and propose the critical success factors ranking, and then to evaluate and present the final results. So this is the working example in which I'm going to represent the modeling, which we will see in the next slides. The first step to follow this method, this approach that I'm asking you, is to define the phases that you're going to follow, to choose your methodology and define those phases. In my case, I'm choosing the methodology I suggested that you use. We have 4 phases, so therefore I put my 4 phases. If you have chosen another method, let's say design research or subsystem methodology, those methods or methodologies have a series of steps and a series of phases. You have to put them as well here because that's the purpose. The purpose of having a methodology to follow is to structure your thinking and having it in a structured way with phases. In my case, in the method I'm proposing here, you don't necessarily need to follow 4 phases. If you think that exploratory and diagnosis, for example, can be combined into one phase, you can use one phase in those two. Instead of having 4, you have 3 phases. That depends on your thinking, that depends on the method you are using, that depends on the opportunities you have. Okay? The second step is to identify the outcomes of each phase, or as I call it in my method, in my modeling technique, I call it artifacts. So then the second step is to identify all the artifacts or outputs that are coming, or deliverables if you want to call it that way as well, that are coming out of each phase. You have to be careful here because each phase will produce an artifact or an output. Otherwise there is no point to have it a phase, because if you don't produce anything in a phase, then this can be combined in another one. Now another thing that you have to look here is that the last artifact we have in our model is precisely our aim. So if my aim is to produce the critical success factors ranking, well, my final artifact will be that one. So you have to realize that our last artifact is the final product. So in this way you have clear as well in your mind what is going to be the output of your whole research, and how you're going to achieve that outcome by going into the different phases and deriving each of the artifacts. The third step in this technique is to identify which are the different techniques, tools, and methods we're going to be using within a methodology. For this purpose, I have different symbols representing the techniques and methods. I use the parallelogram that you have here, which has two the same size and two different ones, which, for example, literature is the parallelogram, literature of the critical success factors. So I use those ones to represent techniques and tools, and if I have another method that I'm going to be using, like in this case I'm going to use case studies, I use the hexagon. Okay, so let's try to use the same symbols to represent the same thing so we understand what is happening. So the purpose of modeling is precisely this. Purpose is for us to plan our project, but also we're going to be using this model to communicate our project with our supervisors, with the different people that are involved in the project, so we all are understanding the same thing. So as you can see, in this case, all the different techniques, tools, and methods I'm going to be using and represented in the red color here are relationships with phases. They have relationship with phases in the sense that each phase will be using different things. For example, in the exploratory phase, I'm going to use the literature. I'm going to do a literature review about the critical success factors to produce my list. In the diagnosis phase, I'm going to be using literature about interviews, because I'm going to be doing interviews to produce my design of my interviews, as you can see in the diagnosis phase. Also, I'm going to do some internet research to gather a list of SMEs that I can possibly contact. So then I have to do a bit of research in the internet or research in different areas to try to identify a list of possible SMEs that can participate with me. In the testing phase, for example, there is a difference here. I'm using a method, which is case study, as we discussed before. It's considered to be a method. And I'm going to be using 5 SMEs, 5 case studies that I'm going to be testing I'm going to be interviewing them and asking them about the rankings of the success factors for developing information systems. And as you can see, another relationship between my case studies is that I'm going to be using the technique interview within case studies. Because if you think carefully, if I have a lot of people to gather information from, more than 50 people, let's say, then I can use questionnaires instead of interviews. So it depends on your project, it depends on what the characteristics of your project and the resources you have, what are the techniques you're going to be using. In this case, because I have a small sample, which are 5 SMEs, I'm going to be using more qualitative data, qualitative techniques, so in this case interviews, to do that. And finally, for example, we have the evaluation phase, in which I'm going to be evaluating all my results. So how am I going to be analyzing those? Well, there is a tool which is called NVivo, which is used to analyze qualitative data for interviews, for example. It's a bit of a complex tool to be used, but if you want to do that, you can do that one, or you can use it manually. You can use qualitatively analyze your data manually and then go through your data in that way. But in this way, as you can see, we have a clear picture of my different phases of my project, the different outputs of my project, and the techniques and tools and methods I'm going to be using in my project. Finally, we can also map our objectives to the different phases or to the different outputs that we have here. In my case, for example, the objective 1 is accomplished when I do the literature review. The objective 2 is accomplished when I do my interviews. The objective 3 is accomplished when I analyze the data and evaluate it. And my final objective, which is my aim of my dissertation, is to have the ranking of my critical success factors. Something that I want you to look at this model, now we finish with the way we prepare them, we have to think about what it is useful for and how do we use it. So first instance is that you have to notice that between the orange, which are the orange squares, which are our phases, and the green figures that are our deliverables, there is flow of data. So we can portray the flow coming from top to bottom of how we're going to be doing the things. But if you look at the right hand side, all the red ones doesn't mean flow, they mean relationships. It's which kind of techniques and tools we use in each of the phases. So that's the way you have to do it. It doesn't mean flow to the right in the red ones, it means relationships. And the only flow is coming from top to bottom. That's why we prepare it that way. Now, how do we use this? What do we use it? Well, on the first place, this is a communication tool Modeling is used most of the cases to communicate ideas and to transmit ideas between the stakeholders of something. In this case, your communication in the first place will be with your supervisor. Your supervisor will have a complete view of what you want to do in your project. So that helps you to communicate with your supervisor. And finally, also when you report your dissertation, when you write your dissertation, this tool can also help for the reader of your dissertation, for the person which is going to be marking it, to understand what you did at the end of the day. So mainly it's used for the communication thing, but also if you realize it's also a good mental map of how we're going to do the project and what do we have to do. In this case, when you have this mental map, you can map it, and this is strongly mapped to your aim and objectives. So you map it to this way, and in that way you are able to think about what you're going to do. You have a good mental map. Now, another thing that you have to remember here, and you have to see here, is that this model will evolve as you move on in your project. It depends on what you're going to do and how you do, and depends on the outputs of the phases as well. Many times depends on what is going to change. So then this is a picture of this moment of how you're thinking through your project. It doesn't mean that this is going to be the way you're going to end, and very likely will change as you evolve in your project, because at the end of the day, that is research. We don't know what is going to be the outcome, so therefore the things will change. Models evolve as the different circumstances of the real life evolve. So then don't you think that you do your model and it stays like that forever. No, you have to do several iterations, several things, think carefully about what you're going to do. So for example, if I was thinking that I was going to do questionnaires, but at the end of the day I didn't have enough people, then I decided to do interviews instead. But that's okay, that changes. So then you project this change in your model. So this model can help you to track your project as well. If you can see, once you have all these bits, you can start developing a Gantt chart about the deliverables, when you're going to deliver, so you start organizing your things. So this is about planning your research, how we're going to be planning what we do. And that's the main purpose of this modeling technique. We can, as I said before, adapt our model to our phases, to a very specific methodology that you have available, the ones we have discussed before. We will produce different videos with how can we do by using, for example, if you use design research, what would be the way to do it. If you use action research, the same thing. If you use SSM, the same thing. But this is a bit more advanced, so therefore this is going to be directed to the PhD students. But if you want to take a look at that, that wouldn't hurt you.